point. I hope one of our next hearings will be on U.S. innovation in the airspace, and it will include discussion of these issues like air taxis and commercial space. This committee needs to get more on top of those issues because this aviation and aerospace includes flying by an airplane and flying in an airplane, but it also is beginning to include much more these issues of drones, of commercial space, of air taxis, and we need to get on top of that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Mr. Rinaldi, according to your testimony, classes resumed last week at the Training Academy in Oklahoma City. I say resumed because they were stopped during the recent shutdown. Can you describe how the closure of the academy affects the pipeline of new controllers and the ability to meet hiring targets this year or any year we have a shutdown for that matter?
Thank you for the question, sir. Yes. There's 22 classes up and running right now. Obviously, if we shut down on Friday, they'll all go home again. That is horribly disruptive to the pipeline of getting controllers out to the facilities and start that 3 to 5 year process of apprenticeship. There are limited spaces at the academy, and we are concerned that the agency is not going to be able to meet their hiring goal because it's been closed for 35, actually it was longer than 35 days, and another shutdown would just close that pipeline for a long time.
So can you then, let's move to another question about retraining the controller workforce on datacom, one of the technologies. Why would there be a need to retrain that workforce on datacom when the FAA has already spent $8 million on training? Why does that training need to be repeated?
Datacom is a new technology which is pretty evasive, and it changed the way the controllers issue clearances back and forth from the pilots. It is something that needs to be fresh, and it's something you need to do every day. It almost needs to become second nature. So as we went through 35 days of not training, as we approach the 45-day period, you have to do a full training process because it's the implementation just won't be smooth.
Yeah. Yeah. Mr. Perone, you mentioned with your inspectors and technicians and the delay for them. From your perspective, is there any way for us to catch up, or are we just going to have to trundle our way through months before we get caught up again?
Thank you. Yeah, the problem is during that 35 days, as was said, the industry continued moving forward. They continued to put aircraft in the pipeline. They continued to make sure that they did their part. Our inspectors were not working, so they just had paperwork sitting on their desk, sitting in the inbox. After they came back to work, and I know they came back a little earlier than the full 35 days, but they had to make up for that time, plus every day there's new information out that they have to review. So it's going to take a long time. And this 3-week period of uncertainty, is the government going to shut down again? Is it not? The FAA had to move priorities around. They weren't sure what they needed to do, and the industry had to let them know and work with them to figure out what's next. So that's the problem. It's not like somebody said, turn on a switch, back to work, here we go. You continue to have the day-to-day operation plus of the 35-plus days that were sitting idle.
Thank you. Mr. Callio, can you provide the committee with additional impacts to the airline industry during the shutdown? You mentioned some airplane deliveries as an example. Are there additional impacts?
Sure. There were airworthiness directives that we couldn't get approved because the employees were not on the job to do it. Again, there was NextGen. There were all, if you look at how we fly and trying to get online, we had planes that needed to be recertified. Those could get knocked back online. Again, there are so many hidden impacts. They're detailed in our written testimony, and those are the things we ought to be focusing on to stop from happening again, because as we all agree, and I'm the one who said it, you can't just flick the switch back on and make these things happen. So what we were doing, Mr. Chairman, was monitoring our airlines' short-term impacts, mid-term impacts, and long-term impacts. We were piecing and patching, as was the FAA and DOT, to try to ameliorate the short-term impacts. But as you look at it, it grows down the line. The midterm becomes longer, and there's a buildup there, as Mr. Perone said, and then the long-term keeps up. We are still suffering from 2013, and every time we add to it, it's wrong, which is why the legislation that you've introduced is so important.
Thanks. Ms. Nelson, other impacts of the shutdown or any shutdown on flight attendants?
Flight attendants know that we were on the edge of facing a real disaster for our jobs, but more so, flight attendants were expressing extraordinary concern about safety and security. We have seen critical incidents, and we have seen those who wish to do ill will. And in each of those cases, we didn't have any warning for it. And what flight attendants were very aware of was that in those instances, if we had known, we would have pulled our friends off those flights. We would have told people not to go. We would have done anything that we could to avoid those situations. And they were saying to us, we have to act now because now we see that there are these gaps, and we can't stand by and let something catastrophic happen when we know that we're setting ourselves up for that.
So you're kind of the first responder in the aircraft, and you're the last to know in these circumstances.
We count on all of these people to keep us safe, to do their jobs, and when people come to the aircraft door, we are that last line of defense, and we're the first responder when something happens that goes wrong. But when we have a break in the chain of all of the safety layers that have to be in place to keep us safe, we are set up to fail. And we were saying that that's unacceptable.
Thank you. Mr. Bunce, I'll come back to you. I'm sure others have questions for you, but appreciate your comments on ODA and certification reforms. I'd like to explore that a little bit later, but I'll now turn to Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Callio,